Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbert is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and it's part 9 of my Boomsday Project card review. And this time around, I have a bunch of class cards and the card that I got to reveal, Augmented Elekk. So some pretty exciting stuff. That said, if you're short on time, of course, there's still a link in the description to my quick reviews. You can just check out all the reveals. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive into my detailed reviews. So up first here, I have a handful of Shaman cards, starting off with Storm Chaser, a new 4-mana 3/4 elemental minion. The battle cry on this guy reads, draw a spell from your deck that costs 5 or more mana. So here we have yet another tutor card, as they're called, cards that are drawing something very specific from your deck. Blizzard has been introducing a lot more of these into Hearthstone over the last couple expansions, which I think frankly is a good thing. Just giving you more control over your plays and deck building is fine in my book. And Storm Chaser in this case specifically targeted towards drawing you rather large spells. And right now in Shaman, there's really only a small handful of spells that actually fit this cost designation. So you've got Volcano, Bloodlust, the Spellstone for Shaman, and then finally the new card Eureka for Shaman at 6 mana. And what that means is that you're going to have to put this into a deck that does something pretty specific, I think, for it to make sense, because most of those cards are certainly slower in how they operate, because first off, they're high cost, but also they're just defensive mostly, or combo-oriented in the case of Eureka and the Spellstone. Typically, you're trying to pull off like one big turn with those spells. Now, in the case of Bloodlust, obviously that is not defensive. It's a bit more aggressive, but for Storm Chaser, I just don't see Bloodlust ever lining up right now because Storm Chaser is not a particularly aggressively statted minion. It's understatted at that 4-mana spot. It's good for what it does, don't get me wrong. 3/4 for 4 that draws a card is great. That's better than something like Gnomish Inventor, which would be the standard there. And it's an elemental too, so there's some upside. But it's not the kind of minion you want to run in a fast deck that's looking to kill your opponent and would successfully utilize Bloodlust. It just doesn't fit that goal. But in a more control-oriented deck, it certainly does make a lot of sense. So if you're building your deck around Spellstone synergy, as we've seen with Giants, for instance, Giants Shaman right now does that. If you're trying to find Eureka for some specific reason, because you're wanting to combo out of Malygos, if there are other big combo spells or control spells added into the game, Storm Chaser makes sense. This card looks solid. It does something you want. It's going to fit in some kind of Shaman deck at some point. Will that Shaman deck be tier 1? No, maybe not. Will Storm Chaser make that Shaman deck tier 1? I don't think so, but still a solid card that does something you like in a positive direction. So fine in my book. So up next, here's another Shaman card. This is Thunderhead, another 4-mana elemental minion. This one, though, a 3/5. And its effect reads, after you play a card with Overload, summon 2 1/1 sparks with Rush. And the sparks will presumably also be little elemental guys. And this really quickly starts to look like a Violet Teacher. If you look closely, exact same cost, same stat line, and it's a token summoning minion. The difference being, though, of course, that the minions are elementals, which is important for Shaman thanks to things like Earthen Might. And also, beyond that, they have Rush, which is nice, because you can use it both as a, offensive measure where you summon a bunch of stuff your opponent can't deal with, but you could also use it as a defensive measure where you use it to clean up, Silverhand recruits or whatever else you might need, particularly with Shaman, because Shaman has things like Flame Tongue Totem they typically use very successfully. So not only are these 1/1s with Rush, they might be 3/1s with Rush if you're able to play a Flame Tongue Totem alongside them, giving you some kind of ridiculous board clear potential. And of course, you can summon multiple instances of these 1/1s in a single turn with cards like Zap, for instance. It would be very cheap to summon 4 1/1 sparks with Rush, and that could be a really, really nice turn. So that said, I love this card at a base level. It's got a reasonable stat line for its cost. It's compared to a card we've seen played a ton in Hearthstone with Violet Teacher, and arguably even compared favorably. The downside or the check, of course, for Thunderhead is that you have to run an Overload card specifically to trigger it, which is not always something you'll necessarily want to do. So finding the right Overload pieces to support this guy and fitting it into a deck seems like the bigger challenge than the card itself having problems. Because I think if you look at this card, it just looks good. It does a lot of positive things. It puts a lot of stats into play, has that instant impact All of that's fantastic. It's just, are you going to be able to support it well? Are there enough overload cards out there? And finding the balance with how many you need towards supporting, like, you know, an elemental build, for instance, or a token build, whatever kind of way this card wants to play, has to fit in with those overload pieces. So maybe this is the beginning of something like an overload elemental shaman. Maybe this actually just goes in a deck like Giant Shaman that already runs a bunch of overload and a handful of elementals. Doesn't even necessarily need to be elemental. Nothing about this is important to elements, just that it sets up future elemental turns. So it looks like a solid card on all bases to me. I think there's gonna be something that works with this guy. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it's one of those cards to just tuck away in the back of your mind, because I think it could at some point make a fairly large impact on the game. Just finding the right list for it's gonna be tough. And then finally, we have one last Shaman card here, very similar. It's Voltaic Burst, a 1-mana spell that reads summon 2 1/1 sparks with Rush. And this card has Overload 1. So suddenly, as you look back towards your Thunderhead, you go, wait a minute, Voltaic Burst is perfect for activating Thunderhead. And there you go. That's another bonus point for Thunderhead, where, okay, now it makes a little more sense. And that means that this 2-card combo might be very powerful, because guess what? It's even more sparks. So, of course, Voltaic Burst summoning 2 sparks. If you play it with Thunderhead, suddenly that's 4 sparks just from one single card being played, and that's kind of fantastic. Now, I will admit, I'm not totally sure I understand the artwork matching up here, because that looks like 3 flame sprites as opposed to sparks. I wouldn't call those sparks personally, but who cares? It's a neat idea and a cool card. So let's talk about Voltaic Burst on its own, because of course it won't only be connected to our previous card, it also has to operate itself. So for 1 mana here, getting 2 1/1s is solid, right? We've seen that before with Lost in the Jungle. That can be a pretty powerful play. Not to mention these have Rush. So for the same things I mentioned previously with Flame Tongue Totem, that makes Voltaic Burst even better, because suddenly they can take bigger trades, clear out things, just become an instant threat and presence on the board. Maybe you just attack with 1 right away and you're left with a minion. But because of Flame Tongue Totem, Direwolf Alpha, these sorts of things that Shaman typically likes to run, because they're a wide board deck that has lots and lots of minions, I think Voltaic Burst makes a lot more sense than it would in some other classes. Now, the big downside here for Voltaic Burst for me is that Overload 1, because what that means is when you play this on turn 1, you're not going to get a good turn 2 a vast majority of the time. And unfortunately, I think turn 2 is really powerful, because you can't do something like Voltaic Burst on 1 and then follow up immediately with a Flame Tongue Totem. Of course, you can with a coin, but then you're losing your coin. You're sacrificing that advantage. So the Overload does make this a little bit less of a natural opening play. So compared to something like Firefly, for instance, I'm not sure I'd rather run this. I do still think it has that important synergy with our Thunderhead guy, and I think it's a turn 3 play, for instance, with Flame Tongue Totem. That's possible too. It doesn't get bad because it's less of a clean play on turn 1. It just makes it that little bit more awkward to utilize. And then it's trying to figure out, can you afford to run this many 1-drops that can't play on 1? Does that thin out your deck a little bit too much? Some of those questions start to come to mind with Voltaic Burst. But ultimately, because it's a direct, immediate impact card, synergizes with Shaman, synergizes with elemental stuff like Earth and Might as just a cheap body summoning, I think this card will still have relevance and still be pretty solid. So I think it's a nice looking card. Maybe not the strongest of the Shaman set we've seen so far, but does have some potential. So now let's move on to a rogue card. This is the Necrium Blade, and it really doesn't have the rogue artwork on it. So that's kind of the rogue coloring. You can barely make that out on this artwork, but trust me, it's a rogue card. 3 mana, 3/2. And it has a death rattle that reads, trigger the death rattle of a random friendly minion. So here we're getting another death rattle support piece for Rogue, which is pretty cool. Seems like death rattle is the archetype Blizzard's probably pushing most for Rogue. Well, I take that back. Shuffle Rogue is probably number 1, but they're also thinking about death rattle Rogue, which is cool. And I do think this is the right way to design a weapon. I think Blizzard has missed the mark on rogue weapons some in the past, where they make rogue weapons that are just about the weapon, and that's always less exciting for rogue because they already have a weapon. But if you make a rogue weapon that's more about some other mechanic and it supports a separate archetype or a separate theme for your deck, then it starts to feel a lot better to run it, because you're not just running a weapon to replace your weapon, you're running a weapon to do something else. And that's exactly what Necrium Blade does here with these Death Rattle synergies. So suddenly putting this in a Death Rattle deck feels really, really good. Because first off, a 3 mana 3/2 weapon historically has been great in Hearthstone. We've always wanted to run things like this. Even Fiery War Axe after the nerf is still playable, surprisingly. And that's because this just lines up so well. We've seen it with Eaglehorn Bow, we've seen it with Rallying Blade. I think there's a couple other examples. So just at a raw level, this looks great. It will never be played over Shadow Blade in a non-Death Rattle deck. I mean, I want to make that clear. As long as Shadow Blade's in rotation, it would be preferred over Necrium Blade and anything other than a Death Rattle deck. But obviously, Necrium Blade designed for a Death Rattle deck, so that's the context in which we're going to discuss it, and I think is a pretty powerful effect in a Death Rattle deck, because the weapon is 90% good enough anyway, and then you kind of get this seemingly free bonus, because you might play a weapon regardless, and this bonus can be rather powerful. Even if it just gets, you know, a small to average Death Rattle, it's still just upside in my mind. So even if it hits that Harvest Golem 2-1, hey, that's not too bad. And as it starts to roll into bigger and bigger stuff and summon bigger and scarier things, or do some kind of crazy Death Rattle result, Necrium Blade looks better and better. And Death Rattles are across the board, but you'll be controlling what Death Rattles you run in your deck a vast majority of the time, and that means you're going to get a good result off of this trigger. The challenge, I guess, in some ways will be lining up that Death Rattle trigger, but ultimately, because you're the one who's attacking with a weapon, very often you're going to be able to decide when that activates, and you can hold the weapon for a turn or two if you need to. You can play a minion and then instantly activate its Death Rattle. There's no difficult ordering problems or anything like that. There is some downside, of course, to weapon removal. You may not be able to control it due to weapon removal. Your opponent might remove it at the wrong time. But by that same measure, your opponent might be discouraged from removing your weapon sometimes, because as soon as they destroy it, they might accidentally activate an incidental Death Rattle on board, and suddenly that's a big problem. So it almost plays around weapon removal, and that's nice too. Ultimately, it just looks like a solid card to me. Is it gonna see a ton of play? Not necessarily, because Death Rattle Rogue might suck, and if Death Rattle Rogue sucks, this card will never ever see the light of day, but that doesn't make it a fundamentally bad card. Its stats, its efficiency, its effect are all there, so this looks like a solid one to me. So up next here we have the juicy Psychmelon, and the reaction to this card has been rather juicy from what I can tell. 4-mana Druid spell, and the internet's blown up about this one. People think it's way too good. Druid doesn't need more good cards. And I do understand that concern. I don't think it's the best card they've ever got, but it does have some raw strengths and look like it's going to see some play. So the Psychmelon here draws you 4 cards for 4 mana, and specifically it draws you a 7, 8, 9, and 10 cost minion from your deck. So it's not only a hyper-efficient card draw, but it's actually a tutor card in some ways as well, because it draws you specific things. You can target what this is going to draw. And that is certainly going to be an upside sometimes, as people have quickly identified, particularly in wild format. Juicy Psychmelon draws you the full combo of Azalina, Togwaggle, Aviana, and Coon, which is a pretty popular wild format combo deck that destroys your opponent's stuff. And what that means is Juicy Psychmelon guarantees you're going to get that off if you build your deck in the right way. And that's super scary. And then if you look towards standard format, which is what I focus on in these reviews, there are still some powerful ways to use this. Big Druid decks, for instance, run a lot of 8, 9, and 10 drops, and Big Druid can pull out all kinds of big scary dragon taunts with this, etc., etc. Now, of course, you do have to play those still with something like Juicy Psychmelon, but you're finding those pieces. You're finding all that stuff you want to play, and because you ramped up so fast with Druid, you're playing those before your opponent can typically respond. So just make sure that you have those threats in play. And then finally, I think even Hadronox Druid makes sense for this card, because frankly, even if it just said 4 mana, draw your Hadronox no matter what, I think it might be playable, just because ensuring that you get that Hadronox as soon as possible is really, really important. And frankly, this could also draw you a Master O card, which could also guarantee that you find your Hadronox. So Juicy Psychmelon is just one of those things that's like, I'm definitely going to get my game-winning card no matter what. And even if you didn't draw a 7, 8, or 10 cost minion from your deck, it might still be worth it to say 4 mana, draw your game-winning card no matter what. So this just adds a lot of consistency and redundancy to some of the problems for a deck like Hadronox Druid to make sure that you find your Hadronox. Also seems to apply to a couple other different Druid decks as well. Now, obviously, like Token wouldn't want to run this because they don't run that many big minions, but there are people who are going to be able to make this work, and in fact might even build their deck a little bit to add in a 7 or 8 drop or something that supports it even better. Now, that said, if it makes sense, if you look at the efficiency, it's off the charts compared to something like Sprint that draws you 4 cards for 7 mana. This is ridiculous compared to Arcane Intellect. You're getting 2 extra cards for only 1 extra mana. A hyper efficient card there. The only real downside or check on this card, and I do think it's a significant one, is that it's going to require a specific kind of deck to make it work. It's not a general utility sort of card. And as soon as you start to draw any of those pieces, that 7, 8, or 9, or 10 mana minion, Juicy Psychmelon gets really bad really fast. Because if you got a few of those in your hand and this only draws you 1 or 2 things, that's not worth it. That's just not nearly as good, and there was a huge opportunity cost to running this because Druid, of course, does already have hyper-efficient card draw with Ultimate Infestation and Nourish. Nourish sometimes ramp, but in a pinch can serve as a card draw card. Juicy Psychmelon doesn't have any other sort of in-a-pinch utility. It doesn't do anything else. It's not flexible. It might be hard to squeeze it into turns if you're trying to stay alive. And, of course, you're sacrificing a slot in your deck to run this for something else that might have given you some extra survivability or just more consistent card draw. So it's not like it's the perfect card draw solution. It's just a good one for some environments. That said, I'm not losing my mind over this card like a lot of people are that I've seen so far. I do think it's solid and strong. It's gonna see play eventually in some kind of deck that makes it work. But I don't think it's like another big problem card for Druid necessarily, unless perhaps it just makes Hadronox Druid way too good, which is possible, but I don't even think that's that big of a concern. So Juicy Psychmelon, definitely a strong card. Okay, so up next here I have a new priest card. This is Power Word Replicate, a new 5-mana spell. It reads, choose a friendly minion, summon a 5/5 copy of it. So we've seen some other copy cards in the past, things like Prince Taldarum, Faceless Manipulator, of course. This operates in a little bit of a different direction. Faceless Manipulator is typically better when it copies higher statted, higher cost things because it takes that 3/3 body and it bumps it up into the stat total of whatever you copied. So you can take, you know, a Deathwing and become a 12/12, and that's exciting. Power Replicate's better in the other direction where it copies smaller things with littler stats and probably generally good effects. So take Devilsaur Egg, for instance. You copy a Devilsaur Egg, you turn it from a 0/3 into a 5/5, and you retain that Death Rattle. That's a fantastic play for Power Word Replicate. Wouldn't quite be so good for Faceless Manipulator, of course. So an interesting spin on copying that pulls it into a bit of a different direction. And I think is designed basically probably for Death Rattle decks, maybe even an Egg deck for Priest, where you have a lot of little stuff that you make copies of, you get a nice positive body on board, and you get an effect. And I think probably even more specifically designed for Xeric Master Cloner, the new legendary minion for Priest in the Boomsday Project, where this is a spell that you can target Xeric with, which is his big condition, where if you target him with a spell, he resummons himself. So Power Replicate makes a lot of sense there because you cast it on Xeric, that activates the Death Rattle on Xeric, and you're making a copy of a Xeric as well, presumably with its Death Rattle also active. So you have a couple Xerics on board that both have Death Rattles. That's the ideal situation for this card, and frankly, I don't think that's that strong of a play, because essentially what you've done is summoned like 2 Cairn Bloodhoofs for 11 mana over multiple turns, because Xeric is 6 mana, you can't even play it in the same turn as Power Word Replicate, and that means you've had this incredibly slowly developing pile of stats on board, while your opponent is doing something they want to do, they're just overwhelming you. None of these cards have taunt or any particularly defensive nature. So it just doesn't feel like that's going to be good, and that to me does feel like the best use of this card. Maybe there's still some Egg deck stuff or just some cheap Death Rattle stuff that makes Power Word Replicate better, but all of that seems just so passive and so richly value-oriented that it sacrifices all kinds of good on-board plays. It's again, just way too slow. Now, I would say that for me, Power Word Replicate would be a lot better if it said, like, give a minion +5/+5 and summon a 1/1 copy of it. That would make more sense because you'd be putting the stats into immediate effect. You could buff that Loot Hoarder or that Egg, and it would get to attack right away, and you'd still get the extra Death Rattle buff as well. That would be cooler. Wouldn't probably be as good for Xeric, I guess, but it'd be better for every other instance of the card. So what that means to me is that this just got attached to Xeric, which I think is a bad card, and I don't think Power Word Replicate fixes Xeric either. So now you've got kind of 2 cards that are both going to struggle because they're so closely attached to one another. Now, there might be some instance where you could use this in a combo deck as well, where you're trying to summon copies of stuff to get its positive effects. But in that case, it's almost always worse than Vivid Nightmare, because Vivid Nightmare is a much cheaper way to do the exact same thing. So if you're looking for like a Velen or Malygos summon, I don't see why you do this. Maybe you want to run an extra one. You could, I guess, run both Vivid Nightmare and Power Replicate at the same time. That might be a reason to do it, although you could also run 2 Vivid Nightmares. So I don't know, unless you're just looking to add some redundancy into your combo deck, I guess you could do this. So where that leaves me is just looking at a card that I don't see who wants to play this. I don't see why it's a strong play when you play it. At the end of the day, it's always just a 5/5 for 5, which doesn't seem that good. Maybe there'll be some other card that makes this work. It's not inherently terrible because you do get a 5/5 for 5. That's an okay stat line. There is a glimmer of hope for the card, but on average, I think this one's just going to fall short. So now finally, let's talk about Augmented Elekk. This is my card. This is the card I revealed for the Boomsday Project. I hope you guys caught my reveal video. And as you probably got a sense of in that video, I do think this card is pretty darn good. I do not think it's a 5-star card for the record. You might have thought that based on my video. Of course, my job was to hype up the card, and it is cool. I do think it has a few small problems, though, that are going to keep it from reaching that utmost peak of success. So let's talk about it. 3 mana, 3/4, Augmented Elekk. It's a beast. All of that's fantastic. For baseline stats, it's got a tag. That's good. That is a good foundation for this effect to build on. Frankly, a hunter might even run this just as a 3 mana, 3/4 beast sometimes. That would be a possibility. But then you've got this effect, which is the real excitement for the Augmented Elekk. It reads, whenever you shuffle a card into a deck, shuffle in an extra copy. So a couple important things to note there for that wording. It's a deck, so that means it works both for your opponent's deck and your deck. So you can shuffle stuff into your deck, or you can, for instance, shuffle Darkness Candles into your opponent's deck and get twice as many. Or you can shuffle a Burrowing Mine if you want, if you're in wild format, into your opponent's deck, so they get 2 10 damage mines in their deck for a total of 20 damage. That's pretty exciting stuff. And then secondly, it also says shuffle in an extra copy. So it doesn't say shuffle in an extra one, or it doesn't say shuffle in another one. It says an extra copy. So not only will that mean it retains any sort of discount it has, as is the case with like Academic Espionage, because it's a copy. So if you shuffle in a 1 mana spell, it's gonna copy a 1 mana spell, but it's an extra copy for every one that's shuffled. So if you shuffle 10 in, you're gonna shuffle 10 copies in as well. It's not like you just shuffle an 11th card in. So the effect is sort of insane and allows you to generate just ridiculous amounts of cards. So yes, Archbishop Benedictus, if you play it with Augmented Elekk, is going to take your opponent's deck, say they have 20 cards, and it's going to shuffle in 40 cards into your deck just like that. And you very quickly realize, as you start to think about all the possibilities for this card, there's like 75 million different cards that shuffle stuff into decks. And I can't talk about them all in this review. I certainly couldn't in my reveal video. Blizzard had some specific talking points I wanted to get through, and mostly regarding Boomsday Project cards. So the potential is there to just create absurd amounts of stuff. Basically, with combinations with like Lab Recruiter and Academic Espionage and even Baleful Banker, any deck can now go infinite. You could basically never run out of cards if you want, making a fatigue win condition always a possibility with Augmented Elekk and some of those other tools, particularly probably in Rogue. That's crazy in itself to just kind of remove a possible win condition from the game due to a 3 mana, 3/4 neutral card. But the problem, as I finally get to it for Augmented Elekk, because obviously the potential's there. You can go play as much value as you want until the end of time. But the problem is that having all that value doesn't always win you games. You can shuffle stuff into your deck all day, but if your opponent is enacting a game plan, whether it's combo or just board pressure, whatever it is, they're going to kill you before any of those extra cards in your deck have any sort of relevance. So you're still going to very carefully have to craft a deck for Augmented Elekk where it obtains you value, but you're able to put that value into action in a suitable time, or at the very least, stay alive long enough for that value to matter. So you either need survivability or some kind of crazy tempo advantage to make it work, and just not all decks are going to be able to do that. Now, I do think in the case of something like Academic Espionage, it might still work because Academic Espionage is shuffling a bunch of 1-mana cards into your deck, and some of those 1-mana cards will be Tyrian Forge Rings and giant stuff that's not supposed to be 1 mana. You'll get Ultimate Infestation for 1 mana, and that will be perfect because you'll draw a bunch of more 1-mana cards, and that'll give you this huge tempo advantage where you can just unload a ton of garbage onto the board and use your Augmented Elekk value very quickly and put it into play. So the possibilities exist. It's just going to be finding a deck that very clearly supports it, doesn't break itself by shuffling a bunch of garbage in your deck that doesn't support your game plan, etc., etc. So fundamentally, a very cool card, strong card. It does a ridiculous thing. It's mind-boggling to me this isn't a legendary. It feels like a legendary effect, but it's just an Elekk. I don't know how this worked out. I'm excited about it because I got to reveal this card. But not perfect. There are some challenges here. Just getting all of that to line up is tough. I've been playing a lot of more fatigue-style decks myself lately, or super grindy control decks, and it's just hard to win like that. It's hard to rely on that to take games to eternity because your opponent does things that are hard to keep up with. So Augmented Elekk, certainly baby mine. I'm going to be playing it a ton. We're going to try to make all of that stuff work. Just not the perfect card, but pretty darn close. And there you go for my detailed reviews. Now let's jump into my quick reviews. Storm Chaser is a 4-star card. Thunderhead is a 4-star card. Voltaic Burst is a 3-star card. Juicy Psychmelon is a 4-star card. Necrium Blade is a 4-star card. Power Word Replicate is a 2-star card. Augmented Elekk is a 4-star card. And there you go. That wraps it up for part 9 of my review. Of course, share your thoughts, your take on these cards in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.